Hi guys, it's Arielle. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you guys are all doing well. In today's video, we're going to be covering the history and also go on a little walking tour of the third arrondissement, also known as the Marais, a very popular place to visit. I have already done the third arrondissement in my full series of 1 to 20 arrondissements, but I felt like the first time around I really didn't do it justice, so we're repeating it. If this is the first of my arrondissement videos that you've stumbled on, then I will just let you know that I like to go through a complete history of the arrondissement before we get to the walking tour. I'll leave a timestamp on screen and down below to let you know if you just want to watch the walking tour, then you can skip ahead to that. But yeah, we are going to start with a pretty comprehensive history going from the prehistory of the arrondissement to today. So yeah, I'm really hoping that I can explain a lot about this arrondissement, show you new places to visit. And yeah, I just really think that in understanding the history, understanding the significance of things, then we can have a better appreciation for them. So that's what this series is all about. If you're interested in the other arrondissements, I've done arrondissements 1 through 9, which I'll leave linked down below. And before we get into the video, I do want to mention two things. Number one, if you do like these types of videos, then I would really appreciate it if you liked the video or even subscribed. For a very long time, these videos were not popular on my channel. They were very much just a passion project for me because I love the history of Paris. But I was really pleasantly surprised that so many people enjoyed the 9th arrondissement video. That was awesome to see. So yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe if you do enjoy this content. And then number two, if you are planning a trip to Paris in the near future, then you should definitely check out my website, getthemargarita.com. I have my Welcome to Paris itinerary for your first trip to Paris, or my Welcome Back to Paris itinerary for your second, your third, your fourth time, to help you enjoy the city from the perspective of a local. And I will just say two things about these itineraries. Number one is that they are vegan, vegetarian, and gluten-free friendly. So for every restaurant, snack spot, or boulangerie that I recommend on the itineraries, I also always include variations to accommodate if you have dietary restrictions. And when it comes to the itineraries, I also wanted to quickly mention that I do update them at least once every 2 or 3 months. I like to add new restaurant recommendations for dinner and lunch, and I always make sure that the hours of operation are up to date, that all of the links and the phone numbers are working to be used to reserve activities or restaurants. And the reason that I mention this is I know that people plan their trips months, if not a year in advance. I know that people have purchased my itineraries and plan to travel next year, for example. And so I always want to make sure that you guys have the best and most helpful guide that I can provide. So at any point, if you want to receive the most updated version of the itinerary that you've purchased, you can just send me a quick email to theearlybirdbiz@gmail.com. I'll put it on screen and also down below in the description. Voila, spiel over. Now let's learn about the third. So when I was actually preparing for this video, I turned to Jean and I asked him how he thought the third arrondissement, or the Marais, started. What did it come from? And he goes, you know, Arielle, when it comes to you and your talks on the history of Paris, I already know that it must have started out as swampland. And Jean would be exactly correct. The origins of the third arrondissement and the Marais are exactly that, swampy marshland. This is what prehistoric Paris would have looked like. You can see that the Seine had a second bend to it that literally flowed through what we know today as the Grand Boulevard. For my last video on the history of the 9th, we know that the Grand Boulevard borders the bottom of the 9th. So everything below the 9th and below the Grand Boulevard on the right side of the Seine are the arrondissements 1 through 4. To put it into perspective for you, my pencil drawing on a more updated map shows where the third arrondissement would be located compared to the fortifications that would later become the Grand Boulevard just below the 9th. We know that the swampy marshland on the right side of the Seine wasn't drained until 1153, when there was this desire to use the space for cultivation. It's at this point in time when people are really starting to value the land around the old bend of the Seine, because these are very fertile lands that are optimal for agriculture. And this is where the word Marais comes into play. Today we know the Marais as the third and the fourth arrondissement, but I think it's important to ask why. And I think the answer is quite different from what you might believe. first, we have to understand the difference between Marais with a lowercase m and Marais with an uppercase m. Marais in its definition means swampland in English, but Marais with a capital M, on the other hand, finds its origins in 1230 when the word marais took on the meaning of land devoted to the cultivation of vegetables. So we see that it no longer refers to swampland, but rather lands that were drained and were now being used for agriculture. And there's an actual official name given to this area of fertile lands that I've highlighted here on the map that runs from Bastille to Chaillot and is approximately 10 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide, where you can find the arrondissements 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, and 16. And the name for this area is Les Grands Marais de Paris. But we can't stop here because in 1962 we have La Loi Malraux, which comes into play and really is the reason why we know the third and the fourth as the Marais today. Essentially, La Loi Malraux aims to protect and preserve heritage sites, and the Marais is, of course, a part of Paris that's protected under this law. But the Marais that we know today and that's protected under this law does not include everything that fell into the original Grand Marais that I showed you before. The Marais that's protected under La Loi Malraux is a homogeneous architectural ensemble in which approximately 100 buildings are protected. It extends across the 3rd and the 4th arrondissement. And so today, when you hear the word Marais, you know that it refers to the 3rd and the 4th arrondissement, even if at its origin the Marais was much bigger. And so now that we've covered the definition of Marais and what exactly it encompasses, as well as the prehistoric origins of the 3rd arrondissement, let's step back in time to better understand the progression from swampland to what we have today. In my last video on the 9th, I covered the old fortifications, which are pretty essential in understanding the history of Paris, so let me give you a very quick recap. We first had the Gallo-Roman fortifications of the 4th century that surrounded the Ile de la Cité. These were followed by the Carolingian fortifications, which were built between the 10th and the 11th centuries. These were the very first barricades to cross the Seine. I want to quickly note, though, that these fortifications do not encompass what we know today as the 3rd. That being said, these fortifications are an indication of primitive urbanization on the right side of the Seine, which still remains very small because the right is still very swampy at this point in time. The lands have not yet been drained. This is what Paris would have looked like during this period. And what we can also note is that the churches that were built on the right side of the Seine are along the major axis that was originally conceived by the Romans. And as just a little side note, when the Romans took over Paris, they reorganized the town based on the model that was applied to Roma's cities, where one major axis was conceived and smaller axes ran parallel to this major axis. And this was their major axis, or as the Romans called it, the Cardo Maximus. Moving along, we have the 3rd set of fortifications that we know of, which were those of Philippe Auguste, built between 1190 and 1215. Here's what these fortifications would have looked like on the map. Note that they still do not encompass the 3rd arrondissement. You can see my pencil mark here indicating the lower border of the 3rd. Now, despite these fortifications that divide them, the countryside and the city remain very seriously intertwined. And when I say countryside, I refer to everything outside the fortifications, including what we know today as the 3rd arrondissement. But why? Why is the countryside and the city so linked? Essentially, you have these religious establishments, these huge religious lands outside the fortifications that use these lands to produce crops and food. And so we start to see little townships, little villages pop up around these huge religious establishments because people are looking for food and the lands of these religious establishments can provide that food. And so we start to see communities form around these churches outside the fortifications. But inversely, those who are in the countryside still rely on the protection and the security of the city. And at this point, I think it's really important to note the two main religious establishments that occupy the land outside the fortifications and in what we know today as the 3rd arrondissement, and these are the Knights Templar and the Abbaye Saint-Martin des Champs. Keep these in mind because we will circle back to them later on. As we move along the timeline to the fortifications of Charles V that were built between 1365 and 1420, we finally see the 3rd arrondissement officially included within the city walls. And what I think is so interesting is that in 1328, we have an official tax survey that counted 61,098 homes. And because we don't really know how many people were in each home, it could be 1, it could be 10, the population is estimated at between approximately 80,000 and 240,000 people. And what's notable is at this point in time, 80% of the population lives on the right side of the Seine, while only 11.5% of the population lives on the left side. And this population imbalance is due to the fact that urbanization on the left side of the Seine was much slower to develop when you compare it to the right. We have ports that are established along the banks of the right side of the Seine, and this contributes to a lot of commercial activity. You have markets that pop up and people are encouraged to buy, sell, and trade. You have churches that are built on the right side of the Seine, and you also have the nobility that move from the Ile de la Cité to the right bank of the Seine. And so all of this means that the right bank of the Seine is developing much faster than the left. Now, as we move into the 16th century, we see that Paris is becoming the place to be. 1 in 5 French people live in Paris. However, the fortifications of Charles V really limits construction because nothing can be built outside the fortifications for security reasons. And so while these walls are still up, the 16th century is when we start to see a boom in population in the Marais, and subsequently a need for housing to be built. In 1543, François I started to subdivide and sell plots of royal land in the Marais. And we see this across the board. At this time, both religious and royal lands in the third were being subdivided, sold off, and many of the buildings that we know of today were built as a result. To give you an example, the Hôtel Carnavalet, which you might know today as the Musée Carnavalet in the 3rd arrondissement, was one of the mansions that was built on the plots of land numbers 27 to 31 that was actually purchased from the Priory of Sainte-Catherine by Jacques de Ligneris, who was the president of the Paris Parliament at the time. In 1578, the hotel was sold to Françoise de la Baume, who was the wife of the knight nicknamed Monsieur Carnavalet, and the name of this building has since stuck. In 1866, following Haussmann's suggestion, the private mansion was actually purchased by the city of Paris, and in 1880, they officially opened their doors as a museum that's entirely dedicated to the city's great history, art, and innovations. If you're a lover of Paris, then you really do have to visit this museum. It's so cool because there's so many different artifacts that weave together the history of Paris, and if that's something you're interested in, it's very cool to be able to see these artifacts in real life. That being said, though, the Musée Carnavalet is only one of many examples of subdivided religious lands turned private mansion. And before we talk about those other private mansions, I do think it's important to first go over the 2 main religious establishments that had all this land in the third that was ultimately subdivided. First up, we have the Prieuré de Saint-Martin-des-Champs. Here's a map of Paris during the Merovingian dynasty, which was between the 5th and the 8th century, and I've outlined what we know today as the third on the map. We can see that the first church that comes into play is actually a small chapel dedicated to Saint Martin of Tours. This rural chapel was built on the outskirts of the main city along the Maid Road, or the Cardo Maximus, which you can see here. Now, we don't know when this chapel changed to an abbey. It's estimated that it was right before its destruction at the end of the 9th century during the siege of Paris by the Normans. But following its destruction, it was Henry I who refounded the church in 1067, and he added on the word champ as the church was in the middle of a field. In 1079, the church was given to the Abbey of Cluny, and over time the church underwent expansion and reconstruction. The chevetts and the choir were estimated to have been completed in 1030, and the nave sometime during the 13th century. The cloister was rebuilt in 1230 and then again in 1720, and the refectory was built in the 13th century. Here's a map of Paris in 1223, where you can see the Abbaye de Saint-Martin-des-Champs in the outskirts of the city beyond the fortifications of Philippe Auguste. And then, as we've seen, the Abbaye de Saint-Martin-des-Champs was surrounded and protected by the fortifications built under Charles V. Today, nothing of the original church remains except for the first 2 levels of the bell tower. This is because a number of really drastic restorations have been done over time, making it nearly impossible to understand the original nature of this church. That being said, following recent excavations, some elements have been found and are actually on display at the Cluny Museum. The elements that have been found, like the modillion and the gargoyle that you can see here, are emblematic of architecture that reflects the transition from Romanesque to Gothic. Now, during the French Revolution, the lands of the monastery were very quickly confiscated and occupied by shops and private homes, but under the influence of the Abbé Grégoire, the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers was actually moved to the old abbey in 1794. And this you most certainly can visit today in Paris. It's called the Musée des Arts et Métiers and is a museum that's dedicated to the preservation of scientific instruments and inventions. The museum is divided into 7 themes: scientific instruments, materials, construction, communication, mechanics, and transport. Highlights of this museum include the original model of Foucault's pendulum, which is a device that showed the Earth's rotation around its axis, as well as the first airplane to fly over the English Channel. Now, let's step back for a moment to our map from 1223 because we see the apparition of a second major religious establishment called the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar was founded in 1118 by Hugues de Payne, who was a knight from Champagne who formed the Knights Templar with 8 other men. The order was both religious and military, and they sought to protect those on pilgrimage in Jerusalem. In 1140, the Knights Templar moved to an old house in an area that we know today as the Fourth, and later on in the 12th century, they moved more towards the north and into what we know today as the Third. Here's what the land would have looked like at the start of the 12th century. The Knights Templar very quickly got to building a tower, which would later hold their treasury, as well as a chapel. Now, to make a very long story short, the Knights Templar amassed immense wealth and land. They had huge support from the Pope, from kings, from wealthy families who either wanted to join the order or just wanted prayers. They were bankers, they had their hand on the royal treasury, which they kept in their tower. And so over time, they just became very wealthy. And in the end, it all came down to money. By the 14th century, the Knights Templar were very rich, and King Philip IV of France needed money. And so he accused the Knights Templar of crimes of heresy, blasphemy, and homosexuality. And on Friday the 13th, 1307, the king ordered the arrest of every single Templar in France. Their assets were seized, and all of their money was taken by the king, and their land was given to a different order called the Hospitallers. The Hospitallers maintained the land until, of course, the Revolution, when it was confiscated. But prior to this, we can really see the development of a community around the religious establishment, like I was talking about a little bit earlier on. The enclosure became a city within a city. In 1786, there was a population of about 4,000 people. But of course, all of this came to an end with the French Revolution when the land was seized and the tower within the enclosure was used as a royal prison, wherein Louis XVI's son actually died. In 1796, the land and the church were auctioned off, and in 1808, Napoleon razed the tower to the ground to avoid royalists making it into a spot of pilgrimage. For the most part, the enclosure was largely decimated around 1811 when Napoleon ordered the creation of markets, roads, and fountains. The Halles au Vieux Linge, which was basically a market for thrifting clothes and linen, was moved to the temple enclosure, and to shelter this enclosure, 4 wooden pavilions were built. Later on, under Haussmann and Napoleon III, these wooden pavilions were transformed into 6 metal structures that could host up to 2,000 vendors. But in 1892, as the popularity of the market declined, the city of Paris destroyed 4 of the 6 pavilions to make room for housing operations. Today you can still visit, or at least see the outside of the remaining pavilions, which are called the Carreau du Temple, and these have always been an enigma for me because when you come to this area in the Third, you have this huge metal pavilion structure that doesn't really seem to have a purpose. I've been on their website and they host events 2 or 3 times a month, but for the most part, this building remains closed. Like, you can't go inside, you can't look around, you're limited in what you can see, and it takes up a lot of space. So it's kind of strange to have this plopped in the middle of a very popular arrondissement, but it's worth it to at least see the outside, and it's located in a very beautiful neighborhood as well. But yeah, it's always been very strange to me. Right beside the Carreau du Temple, you also have the Square du Temple, which is a lovely park dedicated to Elie Wiesel, a Roman-born Jewish writer and Holocaust survivor. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986. Now that we have the early history and landowners covered, I want to go through a couple of the private mansions that were built on all of this subdivided land that you can actually still visit today. For starters, we have the Archives Nationales, and prior to becoming the National Archives, it was, of course, a group of different private mansions that were built on subdivided land that was acquired from what used to be the Knights Templar. The names of these private mansions were the Hôtel de Rouen and the Hôtel de Soubise. Now, the National Archives were created during the Revolution. Prior to this, there was no system of organization regarding the state's archival documents in place. After the Revolution in 1808, it was officially acquired by the state and became the Empire Archives under Napoleon I. The National Archives houses the memories of France and holds remarkable pieces such as the Journal of Louis XVI and the Déclaration des droits de l'homme. And just as a quick footnote, you also have the Jardin des Archives Nationales, which are gardens that are just outside of the Archives Nationales and are free to visit. And they're very peaceful, calm, and quiet gardens. Not many people know about them, so they are the perfect place for a picnic. The Picasso Museum, which you may have also heard of, is another one of those private mansions that popped up on the subdivided land and is now a museum. It finds its origins as a private mansion that was originally built in the 17th century by a man named Pierre Aubert, who was the salt tax collector. And Parisian society at the time in the mid-17th century liked to give nicknames to newly built private mansions. They were really not huge fans of those who built sumptuous residences with taxpayer money. And so this private mansion in particular was nicknamed the Hôtel Salé, the Salty Hotel, which is actually a name that has stuck to this day. And this private mansion is considered to be the largest, most majestic, and extravagant of the great Parisian private hotels. Today it's home to the Picasso Museum, which is dedicated to the work of the Spanish artist Pablo Picasso, hosting over 5,000 works of art and tens of thousands of archive pieces from Picasso's personal repository. Another private mansion turned museum is the Hôtel de Saint-Aignan, which was restored and today is home to the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme. And just outside of this museum, you have the Jardin Anne Frank, which is a garden dedicated to Anne Frank. And what's so beautiful about this garden is that there's actually a scion of the chestnut tree that she admired from her window that was planted here in 2007. Now, while it's not a museum, I do think it's worth mentioning that Nicolas Flamel's house is also in the 3rd arrondissement. This house is considered to be the oldest house in all of Paris, having been built at the beginning of the 15th century. Flamel wanted to turn the 3-story house into a place where people in need and the homeless could live free of charge. And legend has it that Flamel actually cracked the mysteries of the Philosopher's Stone and succeeded in turning metals into gold within the heavy stone walls of this house. Unfortunately, you can't visit inside Nicolas Flamel's house, and ironically, it's been transformed into a restaurant gastronomique with very steep prices, so we really are the furthest thing from the homeless shelter that it was first intended as. Now, a final historical landmark that you should know about in the 3rd arrondissement is the Marché des Enfants Rouges, which was created in 1615, making it the oldest covered market in all of Paris. The origins of this market comes from a very prosperous city and a growing population. If you remember in 1530, the fortifications encompassed what we know today as the 3rd arrondissement, and building outside of these fortifications was more or less forbidden. It's at this point in time when many of the royal and religious lands in the Marais will be subdivided and sold, and the extravagant private mansions as well as other types of housing will be built, creating a boom in the population. And as the population in this area increases, so does the demand for food. Louis XIII has a market created to fill this demand, and so we see the apparition of the Petit Marché du Marais in 1615. In 1772, it will be renamed to the Marché des Enfants Rouges in honor of their neighbor, which was the Hospital of Red Children, or the Hôpital des Enfants Rouges, where the orphaned and sick children would go. These children were dressed in red, which was symbolic of Christian charity. Today, the market is loved by locals. On the mornings during the weekend, there are fresh produce, cheese, meats, and fish stands. And for lunch and dinner, you have many different vendors that sell everything from sandwiches to steak to seafood. And that brings us to the end of our history lesson on the 3rd arrondissement of Paris. Time to go out and see what everything looks like in real life. Good morning, you guys. Today we're exploring the 3rd arrondissement and I'm sitting in the square Émile-Chautemps, which is right outside the Musée des Arts et Métiers. I thought I would just sit here for a second and finish my latte that I got from the Café Kitsune, which is one of my favorite coffee shops in the 3rd. And I also brought a banana for breakfast. We're also very much in luck today. It was supposed to be pouring rain and freezing, but we've got quite a bit of sun and blue skies, which is nice. It's like perfect October weather in Paris, sweater weather. Now, I don't normally go into museums on these walking tours, but I thought it'd be interesting to go into the Musée des Arts et Métiers because in my last video, I showed you guys the replica of Foucault's pendulum in the Pantheon, and the original is actually located at the Musée des Arts et Métiers, so that's where I want to take you this morning. We have a huge day planned, so I hope the sun stays. Alright, so we're in the part of the museum where we have Foucault's original pendulum, and what's so interesting about this part of the museum is that this was actually the old church of the Abbé Saint-Martin-des-Champs. I think it's really special that they kept the original integrity of this building. Next stop, we're gonna swing by Nicolas Flamel's house. On the way, I went down Rue au Maire and I got some stuff for an apéro with Jean later today. But yeah, let me show you the outside of the oldest house in Paris. Alright, so I thought we could take a quick break in the Jardin des Archives Nationales. Like I said, these are relatively unknown gardens, so they're completely empty. It's a great place to stop and take a break. I'm also kind of hungry. It's about noon, but I want to save lunch for the Marché des Enfants Rouges to show you guys what that looks like. But I thought I could go through some of the snacks I picked up on the Rue au Maire. I got these savory mochis. There's dried pork in them and a taro-filled bun. And then for our apéro tonight, I got these 2 honey brioche and a mochi brioche as well. So yeah, quick break and then we'll visit the Musée des Archives Nationales. Alright, so we just left the Musée Carnavalet, and I want to show you guys the Musée Picasso before we head over to the Marché des Enfants Rouges. Thank goodness, because I'm so hungry. But funny story, as I was walking up to the Musée Carnavalet, I crossed paths with the actor who plays Luke in Emily in Paris, which I thought was crazy. He was just walking through the Marais with his friend having a conversation on the street. I was like, am I in a movie right now? But yeah, the things you see in Paris. I'm just standing on the terrace of the Musée Picasso, and I can't even imagine what it would have been like to own this kind of home back in the day. It almost feels like stepping back in time to when this was the Hôtel Serré. Alright, so in an unfortunate series of events, not only did it start raining, but the Marché des Enfants Rouges was so busy and I don't know, I didn't really want to wait in line for food, so I think I'm gonna eat at home. But before we pack it up, I thought I would take you guys to the Square du Temple and show you that beautiful garden. Okay, so unfortunately I wasn't able to wrap that up in the Square du Temple because it was torrential downpour, but I did want to end with a rose and a thorn. My thorn is unfortunately going to have to be the Marché des Enfants Rouges. I'm just not someone who loves crowds, and every single time I try to go there for lunch or for dinner, it is always jam-packed, and it looks so fun. Like, I am dying to have dinner or lunch there, but I feel like unless you get there at 11 a.m. before the lunch rush or 5 p.m. before the dinner rush, then you're kind of stuck in that chaos, so I didn't love that. I mean, I do love the Marché des Enfants Rouges in the mornings. I love going there for brunch, doing some grocery shopping at the market, but yeah, those peak hours are just chaos. And then my rose. It's hard because there's so many. The third really is an awesome arrondissement. But I think my rose is gonna have to be the Archives Nationales. I had never been in that museum before, and I don't know why, because it's quite small, like you only have the ground floor, and it's free. And it's right beside the Jardin des Archives Nationales, where I go all the time. It's like a 10-meter walk. I don't know why, I've never been. But there were two pieces that I really enjoyed seeing in the Archives Nationales. Number one was a set of keys to the dungeons of the Bastille that dates all the way back to the Revolution. I thought that was incredible to see. It's, I don't know, such a huge piece of French history. And then what I also thought was very interesting was Louis XVI's journal, and to be able to see the page where he recorded exactly what happened on the day of the Prise de la Bastille on July 14th. So yeah, all of that was very interesting. I highly recommend that you take a peek in. It really is very small, very quick to go through, but very important. So yeah, that brings us to the end of today's video, the end of the tour of the third arrondissement. I hope you guys enjoyed coming with me. And I think the next video in this series will be the 10th. Either the 10th or the 4th. You can let me know which one you want down below. And I'll see you guys in the next one.